Hello and welcome to another episode of the Silk and Steel podcast. I'm your host, Carl Zha. Today we have back on our show Dr. Warwick Powell from Australia. Uh, Dr. Powell, a lot has happened in this week. We just had the Trump visit to China, and now President Putin is also in Beijing. What What's your take on this? Why is this such a flurry of activity right now?
Well, the Trump visit happened as a delayed visit, didn't it? Right, because the original scheduled visit was from memory in the first week of April, and I remember that because it coincided with when I was planning to go to Beijing, and I adjusted my visit times in anticipation that Beijing goes into a little bit of a lockdown, and getting around Beijing can be quite difficult when visiting dignitaries are in town, particularly presidents of the United States. Anyway, the war against Iran clearly hasn't quite panned out in line with the anticipated timeframes that President Trump was probably working under, and the trip got postponed. So the postponement took place, and the trip was late last week. I think the visit from Russian President Putin was always slated to happen about now anyway. But interestingly, the sequence of visits over the course of the last month, I think, whether it's by design or partly by happenstance, enables Beijing to play, I guess, a very well-informed, pivotal curatorial role. So we had the visit of Zheng Liwen from the KMT from Taipei about a month or so ago, which obviously was a bit of an icebreaker insofar as cross-straits dynamics and dialogue was concerned. Then we had, prior to Trump visiting Beijing, the Iranian Foreign Minister Arachi visiting. Then we had Trump, and now we have Putin. Clearly, all of these four visits are pivotal to not only China's own narrowly defined national interests, but ultimately also the broader interests. I should add that on the eve of President Trump arriving, we also had a state visit from the leader of Tajikistan from Central Asia. And many people will recall that because on the day that President Trump arrived in Beijing, the front page of the China Daily English version actually featured the visit of the Tajikistan leader instead of President Trump. I mean, it is actually an important observation, because Tajikistan, as one of the Central Asian states, is quite clearly important in many ways, not only for Beijing, but for the broader Eurasian project, if you will. And that involves security, it involves energy, it involves terrestrial transportation routes, et cetera, all of which, of course, are even more important at the moment when maritime transport is increasingly under strain, both because of blockages or that blockades that are being implemented, but also clearly great state piracy. So anyway, so President Trump arrives, and look, I think that there's a few ways of reading it. One way, of course, is that not a hell of a lot happened, right? That's certainly, in a certain sense, there wasn't the flurry of agreements being executed or anything like that. But at the same time, I think some things did happen, and those things will take some time to unfold. And the things that happen will in large part depend now on how the United States responds. Because what I think happened, or one way of looking at what happened, is that clearly there was there's a lot of fluidity in the world at the moment. The Americans are prosecuting wars in different parts of the world, and they're prosecuting blockades as well. From China's point of view, it seeks to stabilize its own bilateral relationships, given all of that that's going on. On top of that, as we discussed last time, very little preparation was undertaken from the American side, right? And I think Beijing really understood that the lack of preparation basically meant that this summit had to fulfill a different kind of role. It couldn't be a summit that delivered a whole raft of concrete agreements that parties could action. So it had to do something slightly different. And what it did was that it provided President Xi with an opportunity to invite the United States and President Trump in particular to get away from the nonsensical idea of the Thucydides trap, transcend that, and actually become part of a broader multipolar project that would align China's rise and development and American rejuvenation. So the invitation was laid out there, and in terms that I think by and large the Americans should understand. The raising the Thucydides trap in his opening remarks really was a way of communicating with the American side on terms that were both included some statecraft, but also was intelligible from the American side. The practical elements of all of that was wrapped up in this idea of constructive strategic stability, and the practical manifestations will hopefully unfold over the next little while. Whether they do or not is the test. Modest agreements on trade, a bit of agriculture, nothing really of note at this stage on technology. The Boeing, of course, Boeing's always an interesting one because President Trump has been Boeing's best salesman over the course of the last 14 months. But Boeing is many years behind in its own production backlog. So any commitments made today won't actually see airplanes delivered for quite a number of years anyway. So it's an easy commitment in a sense to make. You know, it's down the track, but it sounds good, looks good, and it plays to the audience in the way that it needs to. I think we touched on it last time, in a sense. Maybe it was my hope or whatever it was, but I was hoping that they would at least open up a pathway to have discussions around artificial intelligence. And as things have panned out, it looks like they have. They had detailed discussions themselves about AI issues, and there is now an agreement to move forward with interstate dialogue on artificial intelligence development and governance. I think that that's a good sign. The reason why I say that a lot now depends on how the US responds is going to be whether or not the US responds to the invitation to join the multipolar world, in a sense. And that perhaps will be something that Putin and Xi will push forward a little bit more on over the next 24 hours or so. But or will the Americans, in a sense, institutionally, the blob, as they call it in Washington, will that ultimately reassert itself, and all the machinery that's in place, the processes, the general animosity towards China and anyone else, the framing of China as an adversary, the sort of attempt by the Americans to cling on to unipolarity wherever it can, the ongoing efforts to blockade or stymie China's own development, the war on multipolarity, et cetera, ultimately will all of that continue to unfold despite what happened at the summit. My own instinct is that the latter will be more than likely the case, but one can always be a little bit pleasantly surprised if at best perhaps some of those things might be tempered for a little while. Anyway, so that's sort of my general take on the Trump visit. You're muted. Muted.
Sorry. So
That's all right.
what do you
I heard
say
some
to?
background noise before. That's
Yeah,
why.
I had to mute my mic because my son was crying. So what do you say to the White House statement that China agreed in principle that the Strait of Hormuz should be open and no nation should be charging a toll on maritime traffic? Some people interpret that as somehow China is backstabbing Iran. I like to get your take on that.
Well, again, the sequence of meetings. Arachi arrives in Beijing, has a meeting before the Chinese side and the Americans met. Look, I think China's position on the war and the situation in the Strait of Hormuz is actually quite straightforward. It would have preferred the war not happen, number one. It would prefer that the war end, number two. It would prefer that ships could flow as freely as possible. And in fact, in an ideal world, we would go back to the status quo ante, number three. And number four, anybody in their right mind would, of course, not be willingly accepting of the need to pay fees. That's pretty straightforward. And it's a simple thing to agree to those propositions. Yep, should be open, for sure, absolutely. There should be no tolls, absolutely, no problems at all either. But then there's reality. And the difference between the American view and the Chinese view is not on what a desirable ideal state might be. It's actually on the diagnosis of what caused the problem in the first place and what the solutions therefore are and what possible solutions are available. And you'll recall that after Arachi visited, the statements that came out from Arachi and also from the Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry actually talked about a settlement in the Persian Gulf that involved a new security architecture agreed to by the nation states of the region, meaning without American presence in the area, certainly not in the way that they've been, and that the agreement be built on the idea of good neighborliness. So China does have a view about what the future looks like, and it's a view that's based on an understanding of what's actually happened. There is no return to the status quo ante, right? So yes, should be open. Yes, there should be no fees. But how do you even get remotely close to those outcomes? And the Americans have no military answer to the problems that they caused by initiating this war. And we see this because President Trump has again, after having threatened all sorts of calamity on Iran, has, under the guise of being requested to defer the next round of attacks, has deferred the next round of attacks. There is no simple, straightforward military solution. China actually understands this. So whilst it can, agree on these questions of sort of principle, it also knows that in reality, you've got to just move on and deal with reality as it is. The other factor to remember is that ships continue to flow, but they need to coordinate with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and of course that's not an easy thing to do, quite clearly, because the numbers have fallen dramatically from about 140 ships a day down to a trickle. But the Iranians have established the new authority. A regime is emerging in terms of what the administrative processes they expect to be adhered to are likely to be. And as these sort of new systems emerge, I wouldn't be surprised if more ships begin to flow again, but under new conditions. Whether the Americans then out in the wider ocean seeks to interdict these ships will be a matter for the Americans, and we'll watch with interest how they respond. But so from China's point of view, certainly things aren't flowing like they once did. There is some flow. Ships are moving, taking oil and other things to China, and they're getting on with reality.
There's also a lot of the Western press right now. They're asking a question about Taiwan. Did Trump, or did he not sell out Taiwan? And he was in fact asked about specifically the Taiwan issue, where Trump says, well, Taiwan is pretty close to mainland China. It's pretty far from us. And so what do you take of that Trump statement? And does that mean there's some change afoot in the American approach toward Taiwan and mainland China?
Look, I think we've got to always remember that presidents come and go, but the machinery of state tends to be relatively permanent. And the Taiwan lobby, so to speak, has been an active and permanent feature of the American political institution since roughly 1950. They have had various levels of influence over the course of the last 75 years, but they have been a permanent feature of American domestic politics, contributing finance and influence to different degrees at different times. So, and they've of course become quite embedded into the apparatuses of state and the surrounding ecosystem through think tanks, involvement in political parties, political action committees, and those sorts of things. So, the idea that a president can singularly and in one stroke of the pen or in one small moment fundamentally alter that set of attitudes and perspectives that have been around now for 7+ decades, I think is a little bit fanciful. Certainly, I don't anticipate President Trump signing any executive orders concerning Taiwan. Right, so we've got to take that context into account. I think he made at least two sort of interesting types of remarks about Taiwan that are probably worth just trying to pick over a little bit. One was the issue of arms sales that he has yet to approve, and it was interesting that he talked about those arms sales, the pending arms sales, as bargaining chips. The Taiwan Act, of course, does not view things that way, and it was on that basis that the congressional voices, the traditional voices, if you will, had a total apoplectic reaction to all of that. You can't bargain, this question. Well, anyway, let's see what President Trump does on that. The other thing was this attitude that he displayed, and he talked about this issue of Taiwan being 9,500 miles away. It's only 59 miles from mainland China. It's a little bit further than that, but not that much further. But I think he was making a point that that the island is actually very, very close to the Chinese mainland, and it's a very, very, very long way away from the American mainland. And in that context, he also talked about the chips, which I'll come back to, I guess, in a tick. But he made these remarks in the context of an observation about about Lai Ching-te and his leanings and his party's stated platform objectives of abolishing the Republic of China and declaring a Republic of Taiwan. In other words, Taiwanese independence. So he made that remark about the distance, specifically about there being some people on the island who want independence. And he said, and if they want independence and think that America is going to come along and fight this war for them, they need to, have a cold shower and reflect upon the reality that President Trump then articulated, which is, look, we're a long way away, and and implied in essence that that if you want to fight a war of independence, don't count on us. That's actually quite consistent with long-term American policy, ambiguity in a sense, and officially not supporting Taiwanese independence. So in some ways, in his own colourful way, President Trump reaffirmed American policy. We don't support Taiwanese independence. And it was interesting that Lai Ching-te then spent the next day trying to scramble around with different formulations of what he meant by independence and stuff. And all it tells you is that what may have been progress from an independent point of view over the course of, say, the last 10 years has already begun to unravel, partly because of Zheng Liwen's visit to the mainland, but also I think broadly speaking, this, there is a little bit of shift in mood on the island itself. There is growing concern right across East and Southeast Asia and North Asia, about the changing landscape as a result of America's incapacity to defend its bases in the Middle East, and consequently concerns about whether it can even defend its bases in Asia. And if it can't do any of that, then the entire deterrence architecture that had been built up over the course of the last 7+ decades is over. Now, how are people responding to that? Well, some people are responding with some, concern. Others are desperately trying to rope the Americans back in. So that's Lai Ching-te, that's the Philippines. Japan's actually not, right? Japan's not trying to rope America in. Japan's using this as an opportunity to say, we'll fill the breach. For you, of course. But for them, it's both, well, it's an opportunity, right? It's a concern. The Japanese have long been scared of, frightened about China. And as China's emerged as by far the largest economy in the region and in fact the world, the Japanese have been, concerned about that. Whether that's rational or not is a bit beside the point, but I think it's fair to say that there are many in the Japanese political system and within their security environment or national security environment who do view China's rise as something to be frightened of. So in that context, the Japanese are clearly wanting to muscle up a bit. The fact that they sort of contextualized that in relation to the question of Taiwan, I think was unnecessary. It was unnecessarily provocative because in many ways they could have built up their military under the pretext of supporting the American ambitions in the region as a good ally without even having to stir up the Taiwan hornet's nest, but they did that anyway. The Philippines, we know, Marcos Jr. said, I think in the last 48 hours that from his point of view, it was inconceivable that the Philippines could not become involved in a Taiwan Straits conflict. And frankly, if there is anything that embodies a loss of national sovereignty, then that's probably it. That a country basically says, look, we have no choice but to join into someone else's war. That's a very
and that's crazy that he made that statement while there was a literal gunfight breaking out in the Filipino Senate because he was trying to impeach the vice president of the Philippines. And I think that might just be him trying to distract the public from the real domestic issue he's having internally.
Look, I think the Philippines obviously is confronting some very significant challenges at the moment. Obviously, the energy crisis is the most pressing of them. And ultimately, these sorts of very, very real things that affect the livelihoods of people begin to assert themselves, right? You can have whatever ideological leanings, that you might have, but if people can't get from A to B and they can't access food and essentials of life and they can't deliver things, then you start to have real problems. And in some regards, they're not really ideological problems. They are just material problems that you need to find practical solutions to. And unsurprisingly, the Philippines, whilst carrying on a little bit about the South China Sea and Taiwan and China, is also putting out feelers to the People's Republic of China to collaborate on exploring natural energy reserves in the South China Sea in some of the disputed areas. So, reality does bat last, and energy reality and food reality is the most significant, reality that countries have to face.
So the Philippines is a big importer of energy. They depend on import of gasoline, diesel, fertilizers, and the biggest exporter in Asia Pacific region of gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and fertilizers is actually China. And China's decision to lift the ban on export of refined petroleum product is actually what's saving Southeast Asia at the moment.
Yes. It's also giving Australia an extra 4 days of jet fuel. So look, this whole situation is incredibly fluid. But so look, I guess coming back, I don't think China's thrown Iran under the bus or sold them out at all. I think China recognizes realities as what they are. That Iran is currently involved in a war, and the war does have wider implications, quite obviously. But Iran has successfully demonstrated its ability to push the Americans not just back but out of the region so far. And as much as China would prefer all of this to have not happened, it has happened. And yes, it would like the world to go back to something resembling, normality ex ante, but that's not going to happen either. The American situation, I think, is actually far more fragile than it appears as well, which I think partly explains President Trump's general demeanor on his visit to Beijing, and that's why it does open up an interesting window for American recalibration. But so much of this is going to depend upon whether President Trump has the ability to carry the day domestically in terms of the politics of things. The Taiwan stuff, I know that people, particularly pro-independent types, got very anxious over all of this stuff. But my own sense is that they probably have less to be anxious about from his words, and actually a lot more to, and they should get no comfort, by the way, from the noises of support that they get out of Washington. Those noises will always be there. What they really should be concerned about is not what Washington says, but whether or not Washington actually has either, well, not just the intent, but actually the ability to sustain the security architecture that Taipei has depended upon for all of these years. And frankly put, I don't think it can. Now, if that understanding progressively internalizes across the minds of ordinary residents on the island and ultimately into the political apparatus and importantly into the military apparatus, the kinds of calculations that will start to play out on the island itself will change. And we're not talking about people suddenly having a road to Damascus conversion on the island to the idea of communism or whatever. We're literally just talking about a confrontation with reality, and of course a deep-seated desire to be able to pursue lives that are relatively peaceful and that have a good chance of flourishing. And if the Americans can't actually deliver the security architecture, let alone the economic foundations, then people on the island will start to have serious rethink. I think the thing that's really shaken people is arguably the very non-ideological attitude that President Trump has taken in relation to the island, and that became very apparent when he again talked about the island as having stolen America's semiconductor industry, right? And ongoing pressure for that industry, or more to the point, TSMC, to relocate to America. Now, if I was, somebody on the island and my instincts was towards independence or at least something resembling the status quo, the idea that an American president has actually just said, look, your most valuable thing to us is something that we're going to try and lift off the island and move to the mainland of America, that would concern me greatly. So you package all of that together, I'm less concerned, or I would be less concerned about President Trump talking about the island being a long way away. And I'd be a lot more concerned about President Trump's obvious limited commitment to the island beyond its semiconductors and the material reality. The United States actually just simply no longer has the wherewithal to sustain its deterrence posture in Asia. End of story. The world's changed.
Yeah. And it's at this critical juncture that President Putin is visiting Beijing. Why do you think he came? Why do you think there was a meeting between the Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping right now at this point?
Well, in many ways, as I said, I think it was in train anyway for a few different reasons. Firstly, President Putin has visited China 25 times now. So him visiting Beijing is actually not that unusual an event. This was the first time in 9 years that an American president's visited Beijing, right? So there's a contrast straight away. The second thing is that this is the 25th year of a special relationship between the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. So a formal occasion to celebrate. That it has come hot on the heels of President Trump's visit, I think is, well, if it was coincidental, it's coincidental. And even if it wasn't coincidental, the optics is the same, right? And the optics is that China and Russia will now be swapping notes as a result of the discussions held last week between Xi Jinping and President Trump, and Russia and China will continue to consolidate their own bilateral relationships, but with a view to how that intersects with the wider, war against multipolarity that the Americans have been prosecuting. So that's important. The other thing too, remember Sergei Lavrov visited China about 3 weeks ago, to lay the groundwork for this trip. So we knew the trip was on. And I think one of the most important things he mentioned in that trip is actually Russia's willingness to supply oil to China that would offset any losses that China would experience as a result of the situation in the Persian Gulf. And that is already manifest itself. I mean, there's some announcements made about oil that will be shipped across Kazakhstan into Western China, and that will, in volume terms, will largely plug the gap, right? So Russia's, in a sense, come good on that, and China is willing to purchase the oil. But this is really about an ongoing process of consolidation of the Eurasian economic landmass. Right? So Russia, 12 years ago, really made a turn to the east, began its turn after the situation in Georgia, after Russia annexed Crimea, after the first round of sanctions. As a result of that, Russia began to turn back towards the east. You've got to remember how big Russia is, right? Russia's a Pacific power as much as it is a European power. And one of the long-standing issues in sort of Russian political culture is whether or not Russia is a European nation or a Eurasian nation, and I think increasingly there is a sense that its future is in Eurasia as opposed to being oriented to Western Europe. And we're going to see a lot of agreements consecrated on this trip because both sides have been putting in a lot of work. Unlike the President Trump visit, where very little preparation was done, the Russia-Chinese dynamic clearly involves sustained and ongoing work at a bureaucratic level to take on what was agreed at the previous meeting or meetings, to bring things to the table that enable the consummation of whatever was discussed previously, to then lay the groundwork for the next level. So we'll see agreements on transportation. We'll see agreements on, I think, gas. There will be progress on the Power of Siberia 2 project. There will be agreements concerning the Arctic development and the northern transport route. These things are going to become more prominent in terms of how the Eurasian continent will consolidate. You add this onto what was agreed at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting back in end of September, early October last year in Tianjin, which saw multiple agreements arrived at for development of energy infrastructure. So energy, transport, trade, so this is overland transport, we've got maritime transport, further infrastructure development in Siberia, Far Eastern Russia, northeastern China, and you know, and this really, in a sense, is the anchor of you know, global multipolarity, because from this anchor delivers the economic heft and the political stability from which other things can then emerge. It's not to say that multipolarity is a walk in the park, or if I could paraphrase someone else, you know, multipolarity is not a dinner party, and clearly it's not at the moment. You know, it's a very messy process, and but you know, this is why I think this visit is actually quite significant, is that regardless of President Trump's visit, this visit will have nonetheless enabled further consolidation of the Eurasian economic landmass project, and that will then feed into the two bookends, right? So you've got the Western European bookend. Obviously, Russia's got its own challenges there in Ukraine. We've got the sort of southwestern piece, which is the Middle Eastern or West Asia component. Obviously, there's a war going on there. But notwithstanding that war, you know, there are deepening economic connections between Iran, for example, and China, and Russia, and Pakistan, etc., etc. So, and then of course on you know, in our neck of the woods, Carl, I would expect that this visit would contribute to the further deepening of the connective tissue, particularly in a security level, into Southeast Asia. You know, Russia's already got a strategic relationship with Vietnam. It's an easier one in a sense for Vietnam to have than Vietnam-China, right? Sometimes it's much easier to not be the neighbor, to be able to, you know, have these kinds of relationships. Ditto DPRK, and you know, the Russian and Chinese relationships into other parts of Southeast Asia are quite complementary, into Indonesia, you know, from a defense collaboration perspective, amongst other things. So yeah, I think it's unlike American visits. This one's a little bit more workmanlike.
Since you brought up about the American visit again, I kind of wanted to contrast the two, because during the Trump visit, he brought who is who among the American oligarchs to visit China. You got all the top CEO of all the top companies in the United States.
Yeah.
Did that signal anything? Does that mean anything? I mean, like, did they achieve anything?
Look, again, I think because there was so little preparation, there was not much to be achieved on the 2 days. If anything was progressed, and if I was to again give a sort of a constructive interpretation of the 2 days, at the very least, it provided these oligarchs from the tech industry, finance industry, and other sectors an opportunity to meet directly, and sometimes for the first time, but not always, with important counterparts on the Chinese side, to advance mutual understanding of each other's positions, priorities, expectations, ambitions, etc., etc. If things will emerge from that, we're likely to see them emerge in time for Xi Jinping's visit to Washington at the end of September. There may be some more commercial agreements. We've already seen a few announced. You know, the agricultural ones, for example, is one. Boeing, I think, is now confirmed that the Chinese side is putting together a group to progress that in terms of, you know, finalising purchase arrangements and requirements, etc., etc. And I think that there are other problems. Clearly, technology, it's not a very simple set of issues to deal with. And in fact, given the nature of American politics at the moment, vis-a-vis China and technology, it's highly improbable that there will be much movement there. President Trump really doesn't have much room to move, particularly in the lead up to midterm elections, where anything that appears to be a little bit soft on China would leave Republicans open to criticisms from the House Democrats. So it's a very difficult and narrow path at the moment for the Republicans and for the president, even if he did want to do something right. The finance stuff is going to be, I think, one worth watching. China's capital markets is maturing. They're opening up. The institutional frameworks I think, are becoming more sophisticated as it better understands the nature of finance capital outside of the production processes themselves, whether it's a stock market, markets for derivatives, as well as the wealth management industry. And all of those American financial firms that tagged along on this trip, of course, would love a slice of the action. Whether or not they will come to the China market willing to engage the China market in a way that requires compliance with Chinese law will be an interesting question, right? I mean, this is not going to be the kind of engagement that they get when they participate in capital market opportunities in the United States or even in Europe. It's a very different operating environment that ties the hands of finance capital a lot tighter than they would be used to. And it will be interesting to see whether or not they ultimately can develop meaningful business there. There are sensible things that, so Visa went along, for example, on the visit. And I think you and I both know that Visa is, outside of the big cities, is a difficult platform to use. Whether or not you can ultimately move forward with integrations of Visa's credit capabilities with Chinese domestic payment systems, I think will be another interesting one too, right? You can certainly link bank accounts and cards to some of these, but I think from Visa's point of view, they would love a much smoother process. Is that going to happen? Well, I don't know. It's an area obviously that I do a lot of research in, but I don't at this stage anticipate China falling over itself on this one. It's got its own rules about how money works, and it's not going to really bend those just to satisfy a couple of big American card providers. No doubt some of them would like to see some movement on things like stable coins. If they went to Beijing looking for joy on that front, I don't think they would have gotten any. They would have been better off going to Hong Kong. And so look, that was the sort of the commercial dimensions. Will anything happen? Well, let's see what happens in September. Maybe as a result of these people getting together, they might actually have constructive things that they can do. Maybe, or maybe not.
So probably no Chinese EV in United States in 2026.
No,
maybe
probably not. But they are landing in Canada.
Yes. Canada and Mexico.
And Mexico, and you do hear, of course, out of Washington that cars, Chinese cars should, from Canada and Mexico shouldn't even be allowed into North America, into United States of America. Well, let's see what happens. It'll be interesting for people to buy or lease cars, EVs in Canada, and then come into the United States and notionally visiting. So it'll be a difficult one to police. I'm sure they'll work very hard at trying to police it. I also saw reports that Nissan is looking to export cars also into so this is a Japanese brand, into the Canadian market through its joint venture with a Chinese manufacturer, right? So I think it's increasingly obvious that Chinese EV makers have reached a point in market leadership that there is no catching them in this generation. And the only way, in a sense, to hang on is to find ways of collaborating on technology and and that's going to happen more and more. You know, we see German firms doubling down actually on their investments in China. We see more companies around the world trying to find ways of collaborating with Chinese battery manufacturers. I mean, let's face it, you know, an EV is really just, you know, a battery with serious compute, right? And so, you know, you need the batteries, and that is a sector, and that's a bunch of technologies that China is by far and away the leader in the world, and that's just a reality that I think European, American, and Japanese car makers are, you know, slowly but surely coming to understand and readjust their own strategic posture. On the contrast, Carl, the Russian delegation is very, very large and heavily dominated by policymakers and regulators and legislators. So very significant government-to-government interactions, which obviously was not the case with the American delegation. Now, the American delegation was very light. You know, President Trump, the Treasury Secretary, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, a couple of you know, family members basically, and then the CEOs of what, you know, 30 large firms. That was it. It was a very, very light on delegation as far as matters of state are concerned. As far as matters of commerce are concerned, of course, it was American big capital at work.
Yeah. President Putin said something before he embarked on his trip to Beijing. He said Russia and China will work together to ensure peace and stability and uphold international law and UN Charter. Now, and he talked about great deal about multipolarity. How do you think they will realistically be able to do that?
Well, there won't be much progress in the short term, right? Other than not letting the UN, you know, fragment and, you know, descend into total irrelevance. Because the problem you've got is that building international multipolar institutions or multilateral institutions from scratch is very, very hard. And I think the practical reality is that both Russia and China and a whole bunch of other countries actually understand that as imperfect as the UN is, and it's a long way short of perfect, letting it go runs a greater risk, because if you've still got the semblance of an institution like that, you can at least reform it in time and rebuild new operating procedures and an operating culture. But if it disappeared altogether and you tried to, well, you know, if you tried to piece Humpty Dumpty back together again, it's really too much effort with limited likelihood of success. So when I think they say that they will continue to support the UN and international law, the idea really is just to try and hold things together whilst all of this fluidity and turmoil takes place, so that, you know, as things hopefully settle down over the next decade or so, the sort of cornerstone pieces of an institutional architecture for the next phase of global governance will be there, and they can leverage that to, you know, to launch, I guess, you know, global governance 2.0 on the back of the UN and on the back of the legacy and the institutions of international law. We have also discussed before, Carl, I think, that notwithstanding America essentially flagrantly disregarding most of all of this stuff, most other countries actually continue to operate within the parameters of international law, which means that, you know, a good 180 or so countries are doing their best to operate within that system anyway. You know, it is debatable whether Western European countries do. I think by and large they do, except when it comes to the question of Ukraine,
or Israel.
Or Israel, right? but on many other things, they continue to operate, broadly speaking, within that operating environment. Look, the greatest failure of the UN really comes to the inability of the Security Council to ultimately, sustain order and minimise the risk of war, let alone being able to bring, conflicts, to heal. And the problem, of course, is that the conflicts involve members of the Security Council. When the conflicts involve non-members of the Security Council, whether as proxies or what have you, it's much easier for the Security Council to sort of sit there, detached and aloof, dispensing power and authority. But when the conflicts involve, well, actually every member of the Security Council, directly or indirectly, it's impossible for it to do anything other than what it does at the moment, which is, of course, conduct itself at a performative level, but ultimately, in practical terms, it's paralysed. That's where it's at. Look, and there's other problems too, right? But I think that's your sort of core challenge.
Well, I hear a lot of criticism from people who otherwise sympathetic to like an anti-hegemonic alliance against US. They say countries like Russia and China, they pay lip service to the idea of multipolarity, but they don't do anything to kind of actively stop United States from breaking the bank, from waging these reckless wars all around the world. For example, what's going on in Strait of Hormuz right now. So what's the point of multipolarity then? What is the point of BRICS? What do you say to that?
Well, how do you stop the United States at this current moment in time from sailing its ships around the world and launching missiles anyway? Unless you want to instigate what could very easily escalate into nuclear war. Okay, so that is always a bit of a constraint. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and here's probably the upside of all of this, is that as the United States has gone around the world doing all of this, it's also exhausting its arsenal and revealing to the world the limitations of its military power. It's a powerful country. It has a lot of military heft available to it, but it's also exhausting it. And as it does that, then the balance of power changes again. And so it isn't always possible, to block the bully in every corner of the world, in part because the bully is in more corners of the world than anyone else is. And it is impossible to, for instance, the situation in Cuba or Venezuela, when the United States seeks to directly intervene in countries that it is physically close to. And physical proximity is important because that's how supply chains, can function, because you've got to sustain this effort. So look, I think people would be well advised to be, very realistic about the composition of power, if you will, and the composition and distribution of hard power, and what it is that individual countries or even groups of countries can do. BRICS is not a military alliance. To expect BRICS to somehow, emerge as a military alternative or as a NATO is actually antithetical to the ethos of BRICS itself. The idea that countries that have been passionate advocates of neutrality or non-alignment suddenly begin to form blocs is to, in a sense, advocate a pathway that is antithetical to the things that these countries, have believed in for a long time. So, if we simply wanted a world where these countries that are being bullied simply respond in a like-for-like way, you do nothing more than affirm that world. And yes, you do need to push back at times, and pushing back needs to be done in a way that doesn't lead you down that slippery slope. But the aim in the end is to try and transcend this. Now, whether they can or not is a different question, right? But you notice how, Russia, for instance, has been, I think, more patient than many Russians even wanted to be in terms of the situation in Ukraine. Because I think that there is an understanding that whether the war was right or wrong, if you just look at its prosecution, that the escalation question must be handled very, very carefully. Because you can see how easily it is and how quickly escalation happens. And before you know what, a whole bunch of people get dragged in, and you're no longer firing drones at each other with 50 kilograms of explosives, but people start talking about, tactical nuclear weapons, et cetera, et cetera. So I think these big countries actually understand that they have a responsibility. And I'm sure deep down at a certain level, given their druthers, they would, dearly love to, go and respond in a like-for-like manner, but they don't, for very calculated reasons. And it means that we are in an extended period of instability as a consequence of that, because the United States and its transatlantic partners are clearly more willing to disrupt the world, particularly certain parts of the world and certain countries, as part of their own efforts to secure their positions or to hold back the tide of change. So I can understand the frustrations that people have, that BRICS doesn't suddenly become a military power, or that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization doesn't evolve from a security coordination group to being a NATO-like alliance. But these countries actually don't want a world of blocs and these kinds of alliances that are targeted at third parties. And because they don't want that, and because they don't want it, because they understand the dangers of that, in a sense, they have to walk the walk as well.
Yeah, I think this is why there's a lot of misinterpretations, particularly among the Western press, when President Xi Jinping spoke about Thucydides' trap. What President Xi Jinping was talking about is to avoid falling into the trap of superpower competition. But somehow, when this was explained to Trump, what Trump got out of it is that Xi Jinping called United States a declining power. And then he immediately seized upon that. I'm sure if he didn't bring it up, nobody would have noticed. And but in order to make himself look good, Trump have to bring that up and spin it as, oh, it's because of Sleepy Joe. It's because of Sleepy Joe. But thanks to me, United States is now back in the respectable limelight where Xi Jinping hold the honor guard for me at the Tiananmen Square because his ego is bigger than America.
Well, it is. And look, it's domestic politics too, right? So, his entire political story has been built on this idea of that America is declining. This is why he says it's to make America great again. Now, if America was already great, you can't do the again bit. So Trump's entire political positioning has always been that the United States today is a fallen country compared to what it once was, and it needs somebody like Donald Trump. Well, actually, no, it doesn't need somebody like Donald Trump. It needs Donald Trump to bring it back to its former greatness. So, the idea that it's a declining power, of course, suits that particular view. But he did misunderstand that that entire framing. It wasn't about whether China was rising or America was declining. It was actually to say this is a pretty dumb way of thinking about the world, and there's actually a much better way of thinking about the world and how these two big countries interact with each other if your ambition of making America great again is to become real. And the best way for America to become real is actually to stop running around the world fighting wars and causing trouble, for others and yourself. But it's to discover ways in which you work and coordinate with other countries. And if you did that, then there's nothing inherent in the world that would stop America from becoming a great country. I might add that not only did I think Xi Jinping say that, I think that there's another opportunity here. I don't necessarily think the American political system and its political culture or its current political leadership will necessarily grasp this, but America is 250 years old this year. And the opportunity is not only to be rejuvenated as a great power, the real opportunity is to lay the first foundation stone of America being a genuine civilization, because it currently isn't one. And if it actually transcended this idea that the world is zero sum and that the only way that America can get ahead is by keeping others down, then it actually has a chance of becoming a civilization, because civilizations actually understand their responsibility to others, and that comes from actually being able to transcend the pettiness of peer rivalry.
Yeah, Western civilization would be a good idea. and thank you on that note. Thank you very much, Dr. Powell, for making your time to speak to us. If people want to follow your work, where would they go?
WarwickPowell.substack.com, and yeah, that's probably the best place. Just go there.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Make sure you follow Dr. Powell on Substack. And what about your books? What about your books? Your
Hopeless salesman, aren't I? Yes, book, Thermoeconomics in a Time of Monsters, available on Amazon. So check it out.
Yeah, check out Dr. Powell's books. Thanks everyone for listening. Until next time. Bye-bye.